Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and I'm really excited about this episode because I get to talk about a game by Pandasaurus Games. Now, Pandasaurus has some awesome games that I really like. Machikoro is one. Dinosaur Island is definitely one of my favorites. But this episode, we're going to talk about a game called Sonora. Sonora is a game that can be played with 1 to 4 players, so there's a solitaire version of the game on here. You can play it in 30 to 45 minutes, and it works with players aged 10 and up. Although I think maybe if you weren't looking at the scoring, it's that younger kids could play this game too. Now, what's interesting about Sonora, well, first of all, the art is fantastic, but what's interesting about Sonora is that it's a combination of 2 different kinds of games. Roll and write games are super popular right now, I think, because of the pandemic, and roll and write games can be played over long distances with a webcam. But this is not a roll and write game. I covered a roll and write game called Roll and Cook a while back. This isn't a roll and write game. This is a flick and write game, and I like those dexterity games. I think they're hilarious, and flicking games are a lot of fun. Crokinole is one of my favorites, and as soon as my Crokinole board comes in, there's no doubt that I'll be showing it here on the show. So let's take a look here at Sonora. First, I'll move the box cover out of the way, but you can see now, if you've seen Dinosaur Island, you know that Pandasaurus is not afraid of using bright colors and crazy colors in their games, and Sonora is no exception. You've got this beautiful box, and this is the game board. I thought I'd leave it in the box just to show you that everything underneath is super well organized here. So these are the wipe-off scoring mats. I'll move those out of the way. And then everything here is organized. You've got markers for the different players. You've got this is just a first player token. And you've got the actual chips that you're going to be flicking around on the board for the flick portion of the game. So let me dig these out, and I'll set up the board, and you can see what Sonora is all about. Okay, so here is the board for Sonora, and you can see that it's divided up into quadrants, and these quadrants are where you're going to be doing your scoring later on in the game. We've got the chips that you're going to be flicking, and they're numbered. And this is the beginning of sort of one of the interesting things, I think, about this game is that these numbered chips that you're flicking across the board like this are going to determine the scoring when you get to the right round of the game. So these numbers are meaningful, and you're going to be making some judgments, I think, about when you flick them. Each player will begin by, they get to flick 2 at a time. So you'll start with, you can choose whatever numbers you want, okay? You don't have to do them in order, but you might be thinking, well, I want to try and get my number 5 into that center hole, or you might be wanting to save that 5 so that a next player can't knock it out of the area that you're trying to write your score in when we get to the writing part of this flick and write game. So like Crokinole, like Flick 'em Up, like Catacombs, this is a game where you're flicking these pieces across the board and trying to score points. And I do really like these flicking games. I think they are a lot of fun. The setup is quick, and that's something that's different from a lot of these flicking games. One of the reasons why Catacombs and Flick 'em Up doesn't see the table at my house very often is that it does take some time to set it up, whereas this is one where you can just pull the board out and get going right away. I would say like Crokinole, except that the board is smaller, so it's a little bit easier to store. Let's take a look at the writing part of the flick and write game. So like I said, you're flicking these things with numbers. You've got to plan ahead and manage those resources. Now, we've talked about those planning skills before, the executive functions that are required for you to plan ahead and be organized in your approach. And because this is a flicking game, we're talking about fine motor dexterity as well. So your motor skills are involved here in terms of getting your chips to go where you want them to go. And like pool or like crokinole or even curling, you're going to also be thinking about angles, how these pieces are going to reflect around the board if you hit the edges. So that's another interesting, there's a little bit of a physics element to that as well that might be interesting to you or to the kids. So here is the writing portion of the game. So you've got the flicking portion that involves that fine motor dexterity and some planning, but here you're doing an awful lot of visual spatial problem solving. So depending on the quadrant where your discs landed, you might be looking at trying to cross off as many of these little hexes as possible in order to score the maximum number of points. You might be filling in here at the bottom, you might be filling in these pathways, and so if your number 5 ended up here, you'd cross off 5 of these little things and circle the number where you wound up, and that's the number that you're going to be scoring at the end. So you've got to think about the numbers that you want to get in here, like where you want your flicked piece to end up. And of course, in dexterity games, things are going to get knocked around. You're not going to hit it exactly where you want to. That's the part that I always find the most fun. You never really know what's going to happen in these kinds of games. So you're adding up your numbers here to cross off as many hexes as possible. You're trying to get down these pathways here, but you want to circle the numbers that will give you the highest points. With this one, what you're trying to do is get these nodes, you're adding up your total, and then you're using those math. So you're doing some mental math here as well. So say I had a 5 and a 2 that wound up in this quadrant of the board, that would give me a total of 7. So I could put an X over here, and you're trying to make triangles around these little plants, these cacti that are down here on the board. So you can get some bonuses, like, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on your screen, but this might allow you to take a mulligan, to do a do-over, or to swap. There's another one here where you can swap places between 2 of your discs. So it really does add a little bit to the planning element here. And again, it's all spatial. You're starting in the center and working outwards from there. This one is a little bit like Tetris. You can see these little pieces down here. So if you've got a 5 in this area, then you can make this shape, and you'd be drawing this shape onto this little crossword puzzle looking grid here, starting right there. So you're trying again to capture as many of these little plants based on these little Tetris kinds of shapes that you can make. And another thing that adds to the strategy of the right part of this roll and write game is that you can move your number down. So if you've flicked a 4 into this section on the board that I showed you before, you could do this, but you could also move it down 1 and make this shape instead. So depending on where you're trying to draw and what you're trying to cover, you're going to be doing some extra, you might do some extra math, but it's all about visual spatial problem solving, visual spatial reasoning. There's a few extra bonuses where you might be discovering some creatures and you get some extra points for those sorts of things at the end. You see it says discovery bonus here. So the way that the game works is that one player is going to flick 2 discs, the next player goes around and flicks 2, you do the same thing a second time, and then because there's 5 discs each, everybody has 1 left. So on your last turn, you only get to flick 1, and then based on where those discs land and what numbers are in each quadrant, you're coming over here to do the spatial problem solving on your wipe-off board. And these are great because they're laminated, and in the box, you saw at the beginning of the show, in the box you've got some dry erase markers with erasers right on the caps. So everything is just is set up exactly the way you need it. This is the first flick and write game I think that I've ever seen. As far as I know, it's the very first flick and write game. So Pandasaurus, I think, has really outdone themselves, and I was super excited to show you this game today, and I'm really excited to play it because it is this is a great game. It is a lot of fun. So there you have it, the first flick and write game, Sonora, it's called, that exercises those fine motor dexterity skills. There's some executive functions in the form of planning ahead and managing your resources, and then there's all the spatial stuff that happens on that writing board in the writing phase at the end of your turn. As usual, if you want to track me down, you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website where you'll find previous episodes and future episodes of the show. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed. And if you like this episode and you'd like to see future videos, you can head on over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.